Welcome to Intersection today. We are really excited to be visiting with Dr. Wes Crawford about his book, Courage and Sheer Silence. If you'll hold on, we'll get started. Um, but we're glad that you chose to join us this morning for this webinar.
Thanks, Corey, and welcome everyone to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. This is the first of our series for this new academic year, and I'm delighted you've chosen to join us today. And I'm delighted to have Dr. Wes Crawford with us today. Wes, thanks for saying yes.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Been looking forward to this for a while.
Wes Crawford is currently serving as the Provost for Abilene Christian University. He also is a church historian and has a part of the College of Biblical Studies as a church historian, a noted author, and we're going to, of course, be looking at his most recent book today as we talk about monumental acts of courage, past, present, and future. An opportunity for us to look at the hard and difficult and yet so critical conversation around matters of race, particularly as we focus on the story of churches of Christ. So we'll look forward to that conversation here in just a few moments. For those of you who join us, let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat feature there. Give a shout to say hello. It's a great place to connect with one another in that way. As the session unfolds, if questions come to you that you'd like to explore with Wes, then I'd invite you to offer those questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a Q&A, click there, and that's where I'd invite you to ask questions. And we'll get to that a little later in our time together. So, as our practice with our intersection event, we'll begin with a minute of prayer and inviting God to be present in our conversation, to inform our reflection and learning together. So I would invite you now to bow and be silent for a minute in prayer to God. I'll close that in just a moment. O God, who began all things with the giving of a word, let there be light. And you, O God, who will bring all things to an end at the return of Jesus, that both past and future, that you meet us in this present space. Bless us in this conversation today as we acknowledge our all too often failures at welcoming all brothers and sisters, and that you would give us the wisdom and the courage to step into new spaces of hospitality, of welcome, of connection, and fellowship. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Well, Wes, congratulations on a new book. This book, Courage in the Sheer Silence, just out within the last few weeks.
Yeah, I think it came out right toward right around the time of the summer was when it first broke.
So we're delighted to have it in hand. And by the way, we're going to be talking about themes that emerge out of your book as you attend to the questions about racism as it got expressed in churches of Christ throughout the 20th century. And this book is available through ACU Press, and the director for ACU Press is offering a special opportunity for folks to order the book at a discounted rate. And Corey will put that information in the chat box so you'll be able to see that. But this book, you're exploring some of the sad and sometimes and often disappointing history, the reality of our experience in Churches of Christ as it found itself in many church traditions. But I'm just curious, Wes, how did you come to write this? What inspired you to take up this important topic?
This is really a book, Carson, I've been thinking about for a number of years, really a couple of decades. I started researching on this topic over 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. When I started at ACU as a student back in the day and researching this, I remember sitting in Doug Foster's Restoration History course and thinking about some of these topics for the first time. Though I was raised and grew up in Churches of Christ, this is not a topic that I spent a lot of time thinking about. One of the reasons for that, as we know, is that within Churches of Christ, we've always been an extremely segregated denomination. And so we have white churches and black churches, and we've not had much connection with each other. And so I didn't grow up thinking about these things. But when I was in graduate school here at ACU, I began researching some of these topics very deeply. And when I moved on to my PhD at Vanderbilt, my dissertation centered on these topics. And so really for 20 years, I've been researching these stories and these names. And I've written other things, other books and articles about this topic. But in the research for all of those projects, I consistently came back to these same names kept cropping up.
Yeah.
So people like Carl Spain or Walter Birch, John Allen Chalk, Dwayne Evans, Bud Stumbaugh, these names just came up again and again because they were so unique. For most of our history within Churches of Christ, we behave just like every other predominantly white Southern Christian denomination. We just fell in line. Just to be blunt, we have been a very racist people in the past, and white supremacy has reigned within our movement, as it has with many American Christian movements. But what struck me about these individuals is that they consistently challenged that throughout their ministries and their adulthood. They pushed against, and their stories were so remarkable. I used to think to myself, one of these days, when I finish doing these other things, I would like to just collect their stories and put them together and tell them together. And so that's really what this book is. It's an attempt to tell those stories.
That's great. And Corey, I'm going to ask you I'm calling an audible here. You might also go look for Wes's book called Shattering the Illusion. As I remember an earlier book on matters of race, that would be a good one for folks to be aware of. And maybe you can find a link for it that you could post for us. Wes, as I was looking at this book, you were talking about all these stories that were unfolding in your research. When I picked up this book, I've got to confess, the first thing I did was not read your part of it. I found myself going immediately to the back where you post actual texts of various persons who have things to say about matters of race. And some of them are pretty shockingly disappointing. And I assume those are the sort of stories you began to see as you began to research this that prompted you to write this, even to have certain persons like a Rural Lemons who would just say, we really don't, this is not a thing for us. We don't have a problem like this in our world.
Yeah, those are some of the documents, again, over the years that I've read and reread so many different times, and I've often wished that they were in one place. So years ago, Don Hames, some of the listeners may be familiar with Don. He's passed away now.
I know Don. I know Don.
He's a great person, and he was passionate about this topic.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he did that was really helpful is he had a webpage where he collected a lot of these articles, publications, letters that centered on this topic, and they were all kind of together, but a lot of those things have gone away and they're really hard to find. And so toward the end of this book, what I've done is collected many of those documents and put them in one place so that people can have them. They're very easily accessible. So I remember talking to Jason Fikes from ACU Press, and he said, "Do you really want to put all of this in the book?" I said, "I really do, because I find it really helpful, and hopefully the readers will find that helpful as well, because it's just some really important primary documents there at the back."
Yeah. So, in order to tell some of this story of the 20th century and this journey of churches of Christ, you identify a number of key figures.
Mhm.
And obviously, there were other figures you could have told stories about, but you didn't. And in fact, as I recall, you named some of those figures in the introduction or an early chapter. But why these figures? Why Foy Wallace, for example? Or
Yeah,
why Walter
so
Birch, or so on and so forth?
so the structure of the book, if you haven't read it, is really, it's two parts. The first half of the book, really less than half of the book, is trying to set the context. So the reason I wrote the book is really the second half. It's focusing on these individuals, Walter Birch, Carl Spain, John Allen Chalk, Bud Stumbaugh, and others that were really instrumental in pushing against the system. But I think to understand their story and to really appreciate what they did, it was important first to set the context. And so the first part of the book is three chapters dealing with the most dominant voices within churches of Christ. And so if they were countercultural in a sense, what was the dominant voice? In really three broad categories. So the first chapter is dealing with primarily Foy Wallace Jr., who was, I think, just there's no question about this. He was the most influential preacher in churches of Christ in that era, for the first part and the middle part of the 20th century. He was incredibly influential. Apparently had a tremendous gift of, he had tremendous rhetorical ability, and just shaped churches of Christ in significant ways. And that's kind of a story for a different time. But the reason I included him is because, again, just I hate to just say it just bluntly like this, but it's true. I mean, he was very much a racist. And some of the things that he wrote, some of the things that he said in sermons and in letters are shocking. And the reason I include that is because, as influential as he was, his positions carried a lot of weight. And so he's speaking at churches, he's writing, and when he died, I think this is important to know as well. When he died, is in spite of all the things that he had said, all the, throughout the middle 20th century about this topic, he was lauded as a saint within churches of Christ. All of our major publications devoted some of them entire issues to his passing, in article after article after article. The things that were said about him, but just he was, I mean, Jesus, Paul, and Foy Wallace. I mean, it was maybe not in that order. I mean, people just held him in such high esteem, but he was just a rabid racist. So that's one part of it, but not everybody was like that. Probably the most dominant voice was that of people like Rule Lemons or B.C. Goodpasture. And the reason I chose them is because they were editing the two most influential journals at the time, the Firm Foundation and the Gospel Advocate. So their voices, again, were very important. And their response really was what I use the metaphor of blindness. They just pretended that it wasn't there.
Mhm.
People were writing to them in letters to the editor. Can we speak about this? Can we talk about this? They refused to do it. They didn't want to publish anything about it. And when they were questioned directly, their response, as you indicated, Rule Lemons in a classic statement, he just said, "We have no problem here." He said, "I've never met a racist person in the church." And
Ignore that man behind the screen,
completely
right?
ignored it, right? If we ignore it, if we close our eyes, right, it's not there. And that was his posture. And that was the posture probably of I think probably most people within churches of Christ. And when I say churches of Christ at that time, I meant this predominantly white movement at that time. Now, there were obviously Black Christians in churches of Christ, but they're meeting in separate congregations, and so they're not blending together. So they didn't have a voice in the Gospel Advocate or the Firm Foundation, and so the primary uh, forces of power, of authority within churches of Christ were held by some of these white leaders,
Right.
and most of them just ignored it. And then the third category for context was I used a guy named James Fowler, who was the preacher at the Central Church of Christ in Birmingham in the 1960s. And some of you that know much about history know that was an important place to be at that time. In fact, he was there when Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Council came through and did their campaign. And some of the most vivid images of the civil rights movement took place there in Birmingham. And while all of that was happening, he was the preacher at the downtown Church of Christ. And he was the voice of the white moderate. He was one that, when pressed personally, he recognized there was a serious issue there. Earlier in his career, actually, when he was living in Texas, he pushed against the grain and thought, well, this guy really is going to be brave and courageous throughout his career. But as he grew older in ministry and as his responsibilities increased, he became quieter and quieter. And so by the time that those things were happening in Birmingham, he was silent. And that's the metaphor I used there. He was just silent and said nothing about the things that were taking place. And so those were the dominant voices of the time. That was what was ruling churches of Christ with this issue. Very little was said. I've said in other publications that if your only window into American culture in the 1950s and 60s were publications by the churches of Christ, you wouldn't know that a civil rights movement ever happened.
Right.
We just didn't talk about it. We weren't writing about it. It was completely off the radar in terms of our publications and our sermons and everything else. But in that context, these other individuals, they risked everything.
Yeah.
They were bold. They challenged racism. Many people know about Carl Spain's speech that he delivered at ACC in 1960. He was still employed by Abilene Christian College at that time as a Bible professor. And he was pretty bold in his statements. And Bud Stumball and Walter Birch and John Allen Shaw, they are pushing against this. And interestingly, within about a year after each of them was really bold about this issue, they were all out of ministry, every one of them.
Yes, that was one of the interesting features as I read your book, is that even those who were courageous, it took so much out of them that they found themselves often out of ministry or forced out or chose to walk away because of which is another very, very sad commentary on the way in which the grip on which racism held our churches in the middle of the 20th century. Well, in some ways, as I think about your book, Wes, and what the portrait kind of at the 30,000 foot level, you demonstrate some of the dominant forces that are fostering or either fostering a racist posture or covering it up. Mm-hmm. And then you're trying to tell the story of some of those who did speak out against racism and call for a more inclusive vision. But all of this is happening in a context of the middle of the 20th, well, broadly speaking, the middle of the 20th century. What are, just for our listeners here a little bit, I mean, talk a little bit about the social context and the realities that were present there, the way in which racism was evidenced. For example, you were talking about white churches and then black churches. White people and black people didn't go to church together, right?
Yeah.
I mean, talk a little bit about some of the social realities of this period and how racism actually was manifest in ordinary life.
Right. So a lot of people are familiar with the big public headlines. We've seen images of the civil rights movement. We know about separate drinking fountains, and we know about separate schools and all of those pieces. What I think a lot of people, at least my generation forward, what they're less familiar with is what was happening in the church at this time. And you referenced the earlier book that I wrote, Shattering the Illusion, which really tells a lot of that story as it relates to churches of Christ. But I think that context is important. For most of our history, as I said, we behaved like Southern Baptist or Southern Presbyterians or Southern Methodist at that time, which meant that we were completely segregated. I know for most of our history, we've liked to pride ourselves on the fact that we were different. There have been times in our history where we have, what's the opposite of humility, proudly, arrogantly stated that we were the true church. And we've tried to make people believe that while everybody else was missing the mark, we were not. But the reality is, on this issue, we were certainly missing the mark like everyone else. We behaved like all other predominantly white Southern denominations. And what that means in our context is that we just had very little to do with each other. Um, there was obviously segregated congregations, but even more than that, and I think that's especially important for our specific fellowship, which does not have a denominational headquarters, and we're not officially connected. We have these autonomous congregations. So some of the things that have historically connected us are things like our journals, our religious journals, Firm Foundation, Gospel Advocate, and others throughout history, our lectureships. Think of the big lectureships that take place on our campuses and throughout time, and then our Christian colleges themselves. And these three things have worked together to unite an otherwise disconnected group of autonomous congregations. And they've done a pretty good job of that, all things considered, over time. But if you look back at white and black congregations and churches of Christ, you will notice that we have not blended in those areas. There have been moments in history where people like Marshall Keeble and others have been able to go back and forth in a very unique way. But Marshall Keeble died, in 1967, 68, and there are all sorts of things that were taking place in that era. When he died, one of the bridges that was connecting these two constituencies was gone. And so what happens is that, and there are other reasons for this too, but for the last third and the beginning of the 21st century, last third of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, there's virtually no contact between white and black churches of Christ. And one of the reasons that's really important for us to understand, and when you think about implications of this, think about the significant theological changes that took place within many white congregations associated with churches of Christ in the last part of the 20th century. I think of the change that took place, the theological shifts that took place in our schools, with our publications, with preachers, and we're talking about a new biblical hermeneutic and all sorts of things. Our identity is shifting and changing. The reason that's interesting is because as that was happening in places like ACU or Lipscomb or Pepperdine or OCU or LCU or these other schools, and while that's taking place in these large white and rural white pulpits across the world, the black churches of Christ are not connected to that at all. They're not going through those same shifts at the same time. We're just disconnected. We're on different planets. And so, interestingly, over the last several years, as we have begun to reconnect with each other, there have been some wonderful work done by people like Jerry Taylor, Don McLaughlin, I know in Atlanta now, and there's some tremendous work that's been done over the last generation or so to try to reconnect black and white churches of Christ. But as we've done that, one of the things that we've noticed is that we're on different theological playing fields. Because we've been shaped in different theological places by different institutions and by different congregations. And that's very evident as we have conversations with each other. And so that's one of the lasting implications of this dissonance and the distance between white and black churches of Christ.
Right. Thank you for that. I'm thinking too about the ways in which racism was manifest in the 20th century, and the manifestations of it. Let's venture kind of more into contemporary experience and time. How do we still see racism showing itself in more present times, and how how do we need to name that, or how do we attend to that? How, even in churches of Christ, where do we see places of racism the history of racism linger on, or how we continue to manifest it or uh, foster it, often perhaps inadvertently or maybe intentionally.
Yeah, one of the ways I've described this, Carson, over the years is racism has been present throughout our history. It is, some people say, America's original sin, slavery, and just it's always been there. It's a part of our DNA. It's that encounter between white and black in America is strong and evident, and it's always been difficult. But if you treat it, think of a metaphor of magma that's lying just beneath the surface. So that tension it's always there.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain moments that it spews out in the public for everyone to see. It's never gone away. It's always there. But there have
Mm-hmm.
been these moments where it just comes out and it's evident to everyone and you can't deny it.
It
You talk
erupts.
about, it erupts. You think about moments like the time of the American Civil War. You think about the time of the American Civil Rights Movement, right? And just these epic moments where people know about, we study about them. And I would argue, I think we are living through one of those moments. You don't have to think too hard about the last few years, the images we've seen on television and the tension and the violence that's erupted between white and black citizens in America. And so that is everywhere all around us. And I think we've seen evidence of that in the church. And the way that I've seen it most evidently is because of the tension that's happening in our nation. I know many church leaders are very hesitant to talk about these things in the open for fear of creating conflict within their congregations. And that's real. It is. I mean, when these subjects are broached, it's just inviting conflict in things in these churches. And we've all seen that.
Yeah.
But I think we've maybe taken that to the extreme. I know congregations, I know one specific congregation, and I think I mentioned this in this book, where a preacher is preaching and he was given a list of words by his elders, and the elders said, we don't want you to say these words in your sermons. You can try to not you don't have to ignore the context, but you can't say these words because they're just too volatile and conflict will erupt. And one of the words on that list was justice. Like you can't say the word justice in a sermon. And I've thought about that so many times and just like, how do you preach the gospel without talking about justice? And I think this is entering kind of one of those tragic moments where and this is nothing new. This what I'm about to say is nothing new. This was a dominant piece of the conversation in the 1960s, especially, is that churches were ignoring or not talking about some of these issues from the pulpit or out in the open because they said, well, those are political issues, those are social issues, and we're a church and we shouldn't be talking about those things. And boy, do we hear that rhetoric now, right? With anything that's off limits. Well, that's political. We don't want to talk about anything political. But I think if we're honest, we have to say if we believe that God is sovereign, and we use that language, God is sovereign. If we believe that's true, I happen to think that God probably has something to say about the way we treat one another and the way that racism bleeds into our culture and especially into our congregations. And I think preachers need to be talking about this. If we can't talk about these things in the church, then where else can we talk about them? I think we've handed over this conversation, this vitally important moral conversation, to politicians, and we said that's their domain. Well, I don't believe that at all.
Well, they're incapable. They're incapable of being able to have a response.
That's right. Yeah, and it just doesn't make sense to me that we've handed this conversation over when I think this is an important gospel-centered moral conversation that we need to be talking about. And I would go a step further. Carson said this, for those preachers that are bold enough and courageous enough to say some of these things, in their sermon or broach the topic and just have us talk about them with one another. Our elders need to support them when they do that. If we want to have prophets in the pulpit, then we need to be willing to support them and love them and support them and their families. And I think that's really important. And I think sometimes we stop short of that in those conversations. We've made peace, and I'm describing peace here as kind of the absence of conflict, not the true biblical shalom peace, but we've idolized this other kind of peace, this absence of conflict, and we said we will do anything to keep conflict out of the church. And I would have us rethink that. You don't have to go very far back into Scripture to realize that the people of God have not been averse to conflict. I mean, you think about the biblical prophets, you think about Jesus. When things need to be said, they need to be said. And I think we need to be courageous enough to do that. And again, back to the book, I think this is a book about people that were courageous enough to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, to those of you listening in, I'd love to hear questions from you as you hear the conversation, the things that Wes is naming. So be inviting you to send us a question, send us something you're thinking about here that would be good to direct our conversation. So use the Q&A feature at the bottom to let us know what you'd like to explore a little more. I'll be looking for those questions here in a bit. Several things you've named here recently. In these last few moments, I want to probe a little with you, with Wes. Which one do I go first? Let's go with, you keep saying gospel, and you keep saying justice. And I'm thinking, we make the claim that God is a God of justice. How can we not name justice as something that's integral to what it means to be a part of the people of God, or to participate in the kingdom of God, who is seeking at the end of time for justice to reign? So the work of justice, the justice work, seems to be integral to all of this. But some of this makes me wonder how we define gospel. Is it because we've shrunk gospel into some little something about my own personal relationship with Jesus, and we don't see that actually God has an interest in humankind and peoples and people groups and families? Help me understand why have we gone so far awry with where has this anemic notion of gospel come from?
I think, and again, I want to underscore that this is nothing new. So it's not as if over time we've narrowed the scope of gospel and defining it a certain way. And I want to be generous to us. So I'll give that response first, and I'll tell you what I really think. But let me get it this way. I think one of the most important lasting contributions that Martin Luther King Jr. made to us, and the reason we remember him, and the reason he was effective when other people were not. There were other people challenging, racism and discrimination in his time.
Yes.
People say, well, it was his rhetorical ability. There were other very talented preachers at that time, black and white, that were saying similar kinds of things.
Right.
I think one of the things that he did for us is that he reframed the discussion as a moral discussion. So in his time, even among many black preachers, they were still treating this as a social issue. It's a social issue in America that we need to fix. And so we're going to go to the courts. We're going to use politicians. And all those things are important. And he didn't discount any of those. But he shifted the conversation when he said, but this is a moral issue. And if it's a moral issue, that changes everything. You need to use the analogy of adultery, for example. If you believe that adultery is a sin, and it's morally wrong, well, then you can't tell the spouse, well, you know what? We want you to gradually ease out of that adulterous relationship, but you just take your time. We don't want to cause a problem. Just kind of at your own speed, and with the way that causes the least amount of conflict. We want you to ease out of that relationship and go back to your spouse. We would never do that. And that was Martin Luther King's point. He's saying there were people that said, oh, we believe racism is wrong. We believe discrimination is wrong and segregation is wrong, but we'll gradually ease out of it. Let's do it slowly, gradually, and then eventually it'll take care of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if it's a moral issue, and in other words, if it's a sin, if discrimination is a sin, well, then you can't do this gradually. Like any other sin, you have to stop and you have to go a different direction. And that's what I'm saying. I think it's intricately tied, the discrimination and racism and all this gets to the heart of our identity as people of God.
Mm-hmm.
We were all created in the image of God. This is a theological issue. And the extent to which we see that our brothers and sisters are not being treated as people made in the image of God, it is our responsibility as people of faith to respond to that
Mm-hmm.
and to be the mouthpiece of God in a sense for those people and to speak into the culture in which we live.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that King brought to us. And I think we need to hear that now. I think we're hearing the same rhetoric. You can't talk about these things in church because it's political. Well, I would disagree. I don't think this is a purely political issue, a purely social issue. I think it's a moral gospel issue that demands our attention. And so that's the generous response. And I think those are all very true. I also will say that I think sometimes we use that language as a cop-out. We say things are political when we don't want to talk about them or when we disagree with them. And we saw this really evidently in the 1960s. One of the prime examples, I remember vividly, Bud Stumbaugh, in one of the speeches that's published in the back of this book, talked about this openly. So it's the 1960s. We have people in the church saying you can't talk about Martin Luther King, you can't talk about the civil rights movement in the church. Those are political, social issues. They don't belong in the church. We're just going to preach the gospel. And as they're saying that, they also, churches, are campaigning against John F. Kennedy because he was a Catholic and they didn't want a Catholic in the White House. So they're allowing politicians to come to their pulpits on Sunday morning. Christians, as led by congregations, are canvassing neighborhoods with political propaganda against John F. Kennedy. I mean, it doesn't get more political than that. What I'm saying is, I think sometimes we just throw out, it's the get out of jail free card, right? We're not going to talk about that because it's political unless we want to talk about something else political, and then we're all in.
Right. So there's there's a certain failure of nerve that plays itself out in this to take on harder things,
Right.
or things that are going to push against the grain of our peers, or et cetera, et cetera. It was for example, the thought of a Catholic president in the 60s was a pretty scary thing for
Right.
just Americans generally.
Yeah.
Particularly in the South. And yeah. Which brings me to the other thing that I've been musing about is how much courage it takes to step beyond a person's fears or a community's fears to follow or be obedient to a robust call of what gospel means, what grace means, what welcome and hospitality means, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And
It's
so,
difficult. I mean, as you know, Carson, and maybe a lot of the people listening know, before I was teaching, I was a preacher for 20 years, and I know what that's like. I'm not trying to discount the difficulty of this. It's difficult to talk about these topics in public
yeah,
and from the pulpit, and the retaliation and the response. I mean, that's real, and it's no fun having those conversations on Monday morning or Sunday afternoon right after you finish preaching, and I've had those conversations, and it's tough. Ministry is difficult.
yeah. Hey, looking at some questions that are coming in, Wes, what kind of perspective do Black Christians in Churches of Christ bring to this? What might we be hearing from persons who are our Black brothers and sisters and congregations of churches of
Yeah.
Christ.
One of the things I say at the beginning of this book, or Shattering the Illusion, the earlier book, really deals a lot with Black and white churches of Christ. So I tell those stories together and some of the interaction we've had with each other. This book really centers on white leaders in churches of Christ. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is there's some excellent work being done by a good friend of mine, Ed Robinson, who's African American scholar in Churches of Christ, historian, that has written and continues to write excellent books on a lot of things having to do with Black churches of Christ. And he's doing cutting edge research. It's fantastic. And if you haven't read any of Ed's writings and books, I would push you in that direction. It is tremendous.
Could I put a footnote in here? And Corey, I'm put you on another Audible call here. We had Ed and Wes on together a year or so ago on an intersection event, and that would be a great introduction to Ed's great work, would be maybe through that intersection that took place a year or so ago. I can't remember when it was, Wes.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. But I would direct people in that direction because he's done excellent work. And so I very intentionally decided that because Ed is doing such good work in that area, and he's publishing, books about Marshall Keeble and G.P. Bowser and Cassius and all these other tremendous, powerful Black leaders in churches of Christ that are speaking, obviously, against racism, and they are engaging this system in some of them very profound ways. But as that scholarship has been coming to the public over the last several years through his writings, we really haven't done much at all with white churches of Christ. How were they responding to the civil rights movement? How were they responding to all these things that were taking place? And I dove into that space because I felt like there was a gap. And so one of the reasons I focus on white people in churches of Christ is because I think there's a gap in our historiography there. But a second reason, and I explained this in the introduction of the book, is that in that time, the white churches of Christ, they held the power in the denomination. They were steering our institutions. They were in charge of the journals. They were in charge of the colleges. They were leading the lectureships. They were the ones that were steering us in certain directions. And what I wanted to get at was what is really influencing churches of Christ. And it were these leaders. These leaders were the ones that were doing that, and they were white because they held all the power at that time, institutional power, to lead the denomination in that direction. Which is another reason I'll say this here as well, and I mentioned this in the introduction as well. Those that read this will notice an absence of female voices in this conversation, and it's for the same reason. Because there were not women that were preaching in churches of Christ at that time. They were not, serving as college presidents or journal editors, and they were not steering the denomination in a way that some of these white men were. And so I'm hopeful. You talked earlier about, are there other voices? I'm hopeful that in the coming years that we will uncover some of those voices, because there were surely women that were cutting against the grain as well. They weren't doing it from some of these seats of power, but they were surely doing it. And I'm hopeful that in the coming years we'll uncover some of that in research. But really, this book was focusing on the people that are leading the denomination institution.
Right. Oh, that's good. Thank you for that. Another question that's coming in is really a pragmatic kind of question that I think folks would be curious about. So I'm a minister or a leader in a church. How could I, what way could I, how could I respond to that? Do you have any practical suggestions? I'm thinking you may have some material. I think there's some material in your book, but what would you say what would be some practical things that a minister or church leader could do in a congregation to address or to lean into attending to the realities of racism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the obvious ones is, I would say maybe that's what we've been talking about, is have the courage to speak about some of these things from the pulpit. I don't think we need to shy away from those conversations. I think they're important. And I think we need to frame them as moral issues, as gospel-centered issues, and help your congregation by showing them how those things are connected. Because I think they hear so much from everywhere else, everyone around them. They try to paint this as a political issue or as a social issue. Help them see how deeply connected this is to the character and the nature of God. And I think that's one thing that's really important. So that's an institutional systemic thing. But I think just practically as a minister, this is going to sound so basic, but we've got if you're white, you need to get to know and be in a relationship with your black brothers and sisters. If you're black, you need to be in a relationship and get to know your white brothers and sisters. And I think that's the key to all of this. When I was preaching in Tyler, it was in the time, as some of you will recall, a few years ago when some of the tensions were really coming to the surface. It was the volcano spewing out the magma, to use an earlier metaphor. There was violence in the streets, there were riots, and there were a lot of black Christians in Tyler that I knew that they were afraid. They were afraid of what was happening, and they felt alone. And so I had a friendship with a black minister in town, and it started. We had lunch one day, and we said, "How can we engage this?" And before long, we had a group of, I think by the time I left Tyler, there were probably 50 or so black and white ministers meeting regularly for lunch once a month. We would just get to know each other. We had some service projects together. Our congregations, we made efforts to get our congregations to know each other. And the reason that's important is, as we hear these things, we watch these things happening on the news, if we're not careful, it can just become statistics, and it can just be the images on a screen. But when you sit down across the table from someone and you start hearing their story and you realize this is real.
Right.
And there are people that are members of my Christian family, brothers and sisters that worship in a building down the street, and they are afraid. And what does my response need to be to that? How can I love them better? And I would encourage you to do that. Whoever's asking that question, I think it starts with those personal relationships, those one-on-one meetings, and then those 2-on-2 and 10-on-10 meetings, just gathering people together. We need to know each other better. And right now we simply do not.
I love that, Wes. You're reminding me when I was in Minnesota. I spent 30 years as a congregational minister preaching each week, 20 of those years in Indianapolis. And as a young minister, I was so blessed to have a regular visit with G.P. Holt. And we talked, and it was so generous of him. And it led to lots of good conversations and opportunities for congregations to gather. So
he's one of those black leaders in churches of Christ that was doing remarkable things for many decades. And
that were often hidden. They were usually hidden to white churches. Yeah. And I love that. Hey, another question popped up here. In your story, in your gathering of stories, as you see this, what's one or two stories that you didn't tell but would have liked to have told? I know you mentioned a number of figures early, and I'm thinking about your question as well. As I recall, you name several people that you say, well, I'm not going to talk about so-and-so and so-and-so, but be curious what stories are still out there that might contribute to understanding both the tragedy and maybe the courage or the courage of this time.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that happens, Carson, when you write a book like this about stories, and especially relatively recent history, is that when it's published, or even it's about to be published, and people hear that it's about to come out, I start getting emails from people that want to share their story. Like, did you know about this? Did you know about that? One of the wonderful things that's happened over the last several months, I remember it was just before the book came out, and he heard that it was going to be published, and I received an email from Walter Birch's son.
Oh,
who heard it was going to be published and was very thankful that I was going to tell that story of his father, and then he told me a couple of other things. I won't share here, but it was so wonderful
yeah,
to hear some of the backstory of some of
right.
that, and I've had conversations with numerous people around. When I'm speaking in churches or others, and I'll tell some of these stories and I'll say, "Hey, but did you know this? Did you know that?" And so those stories are out there. And what I've tried to do is tell the stories that really pertain to some of these very influential key leaders in these certain positions that make their stories important because they steered us in certain directions. But
Right.
there are many others. One of the interesting things, and I think this did make it into the book, but one of the curious things I've always wondered about for years, when I first heard his story, back when I was a graduate student at ACU, was Carl Spain. He
Mhm.
delivered the speech in 1960, which if you've never heard the speech, you can go to ACU's website on the library, and there's an audio recording of the sermon. But there's also the transcript, which is in the back of this book. And it's a profound, pointed speech. I mean, to give you context, this is 1960. We're 15 years removed from the end of World War II. And in this speech in Abilene, and he's still drawing a paycheck from ACC at this time. He compares Churches of Christ and the schools that are operated by Churches of Christ, like ACC, compares them to Nazis and communists. And I mean, it is pointed. I mean, there he does not pull punches. But then he's silent. And this is what's always puzzled me. So he delivers this speech in 1960, and then after that, you never hear anything about him again. A lot of the things I write about in this book, Walter Birch is really orchestrating a lot of these meetings that are taking place and special publications related to this and some of our journals, and and he's really not a part of any of that. And I've always wondered, like, what happened to Carl Spain? And I've heard stories over the years, anecdotally, even being back on the ACU's campus now and knowing people that knew him, and they would tell stories that, I mean, he received death threats. It was awful for him and his family in the years following that speech. It was just incredibly difficult for him personally. And so I can understand, and I can only imagine, and I'm deducing this, that he just decided publicly to back up from this issue. He had had his say, but you really don't read much about him again publicly. But what I learned in the process of researching for this book are the things that he was continuing to do behind the scenes. And so one of the things that happened is when ACC desegregated their schools a year after he delivered that speech, and I believe his speech had something to do with that, with the administration. That's another story. But so Black students were welcomed onto this campus. And as you might expect, it was difficult for them. And there was one particular student, one of the first African American students that was allowed to attend ACC at that time, was friends with a white girl on campus. And the father of the white girl found out that they were friends and came to campus one weekend with his son. So this girl's brother, so her brother and father were on campus, and they found this black student and beat him almost to the point of death. Left him in a field outside of Abilene, and he was going to die. Someone found him, and they brought him to the hospital, and he stayed there for a long time, touch and go for a long time. But what I found out from this research and talking to people is that Carl Spain, he was one of his professors, and Carl Spain went to the hospital and stayed with that student for weeks and rarely left his bedside, and would just minister to him and to his family. And that's a pretty profound story. And I think things like that happened in other places, but the book is an attempt to tell kind of some of those stories. I'm eager to hear other stories because
Yeah.
I've loved hearing things since the book has come out,
Yeah.
and I know there are others out there.
That's great. That's great. Wes, thank you for today. As we wrap up, I'm just wondering, as you think about this topic, you think about uh, churches today, leaders today? Just what would be one thing you'd kind of want to leave us with, kind of a parting shot as you think about um, the reality, the shadow of racism as it has played itself out in our narratives, continues to continues to play itself out. What what would be your last word today?
We live in an incredibly polarized moment um, with everything. And you and I talked about this before, Carson, but as we speak in churches, different places, and we're talking to Christians, we find ways to divide over everything. It's difficult to talk about anything in the pulpit without offending someone. That's where we are. And so it's really tempting. I think it's very tempting for preachers, for church leaders to want to ignore this because there's so much conflict and it's so heavy. So many things are so heavy right now. But I would want to remind us, and again, this is one of the reasons I wrote this book in the first place, and take the name off the cover right there. I want us to have courage. Um, Ministry is difficult work. It's important work. But I would hope that we would have courage to say things that need to be said, do things that need to be done, and do the hard work of forming those relationships with people that think differently than we do.
Mhm.
I'll share one quick story that I heard, and probably many of you have heard this as well. It was one of the encouraging things that happened to me, or that I heard about over the last week or so, in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk things that have taken place. I saw several days after it happened, it popped up in the news somewhere, and I don't even remember his name, Carson, but he's African American journalist on CNN, and can't think of his name. Surely people are listening know exactly, and they're screaming it at the computer right now. But he's an individual that thinks thought very differently than Charlie Kirk. They were on different sides of the political spectrum, and in public, they were jabbing at each other, for a long time in public. And then there was Charlie Kirk's death. And then about a week after that happened, this analyst came on TV and he said something. I was so thankful that he said this. He said, we have a tendency to demonize people on the other side. That we just, and because of the way that our society is structured and the way that our social media feeds are structured, frankly, we only hear certain voices. So if you're on Facebook or Instagram or something else, depending on what you like and what you click and what you spend more time looking at, those are the things you're going to see more and more and more and more. Those algorithms are designed that way. So the people that love Charlie Kirk, they just don't understand how anybody could say anything negative
Mhm.
about him.
Mhm.
And those that hate Charlie Kirk, they just can't imagine how anybody would say anything positive about him because those are the things we see. So this analyst told the story. He said, I want America to know. He said, this is something that happened. I think it was the day of Charlie Kirk's death, or maybe it may have been the evening before. He said he received a text message, a private text message from Charlie Kirk. And he said to him, he said, listen, can we meet sometime? Just the two of us. I want to understand your position on race better than I do now. And whatever you think, you may be diametrically opposed to his politics or his positions, or you may think that he hung the moon, whatever the case may be. We need more of that.
Mhm.
Van Jones, somebody just put it in the comments. Yes, Van Jones told that story. We need more of that from both of them. We need to tell those stories when they happen.
Yeah.
We need to reach out more across the aisle and realize we're not all going to agree, but boy, do we need stronger relationships, and boy,
Thank
do
you.
we need
Yeah.
empathy, and we need a lot of humility.
Yeah. Well said. Wes, thank you so much. And to those of you joining us today, again, want to say a word about Wes's book, Courage in the Sheer Silence, 40% off through ACU Press. You've seen that in the text or the chat feed. So it's all there for you to continue the conversation. for yourself and maybe in folks in your church or others, we do need to be able to talk to each other. So thank you, Wes, for your time today. Thank you all for participating. Our next intersection event is on October the 14th. Dudley Chansey's been doing research about in intergenerational life in congregations. He's written a book about being a good grandparent. And we're going to talk about keeping faith alive with Dudley on October the 14th. So look for that. Check the Siburt Institute website, siburtinstitute.org, for all of our events and programs. And we'll just hope to see you again on our next intersection. Again, thanks, Wes, for your time today, and blessings to all of you. So long.